Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel. Honestly, you don't want to be taking generic legal advice from a YouTube channel or podcast in any event. On with the show. Good morning and welcome to Virtual Legality. I'm your host, Richard Hoeg, managing partner of the Hoeg Law business law firm of Northville, Michigan. And today I wanted to talk about an article that I saw the other day that's been doing the rounds on my Twitter and on social media in general called How Do We Finally Talk About Ethics? And this was an article done by Russ Pitts at The Escapist. He was originally at The Escapist. He left The Escapist. He went on to do Polygon. He's back at The Escapist, the new Escapist. And I've gone to the tab now. I want to apologize for essentially the formatting here. It looks like The Escapist has some issue with their HTML code in Chrome or otherwise, or I'm doing something wrong. But suffice it to say, we can still read some of the pertinent parts here. It's just not going to look all that good. And this article is essentially a reflection on the ethics problems that are currently facing video games journalists, but also a reflection on the Gamergate movement, which essentially was a years old kind of upswell of folks that, depending on who you ask, were either trying to get more ethical treatment of video games and the gamer populace, or were harassing journalists and were harassing game developers. And I certainly think Mr. Pitts here makes a credible case about it being, if not originally for the latter purpose, the harassment purpose, co-opted by that purpose in the end. And he wants to bring up this discussion primarily because it's a provocative one and it gets clicks and it's useful to talk about. But I also think the actual substance of the matter is interesting to talk about, both how Gamergate is thought of now, what it was, how it was used, why that's improper, and also kind of the underlying issues that are only going to become essentially more apparent as we move forward in the media landscape from 2019 on. And I do think there are discussions to be had that are unfortunately very difficult to have because of the harassment, because of the bad things that these Gamergate folks did in pursuing whatever ends they were trying to pursue. And with that all said, I want to say the stuff that I talk about here with respect to Gamergate, with respect to those things that happened, I don't have any personal knowledge of. I wasn't a part of those activities, those groups. I did participate in some of the forums and some of the board posts when this happened and saw it happening, but I don't have any greater insight than probably you do as to what happened on the ground or what those groups did, other than what's being said by the folks that are reporting on it now, the Wikipedia entries, things of that nature. And so I do want to talk a little bit about that activity as well as kind of the underlying discussion. So how do we finally talk about ethics? You turn on a Virtual Legality episode and you see what I have to say. So let's take a look at this article. First, Mr. Pitts describes his leaving of Escapist, going to Polygon, and talking about Gamergate. And he says, the memes about what Gamergate was really about are too numerous to count, but the most well-known is probably the image of It's Pennywise the Clown whispering up from the storm drain that it's about ethics, or that it's about ethics in games journalism. And then he goes on to talk about the fact that Gamergate wound up doxing and bullying and harassing and threatening and assaulting and swatting and forcing people to change jobs and all these very bad things. And I think one of the things that he brings up in this article that is absolutely correct is to the extent there was ever a kernel of an argument, there was an issue, there was something that should have been addressed by the journalistic core or by the development groups that make video games or either or both, that ability to have that discussion, that ability to have any kind of change that these folks might have wanted to see if they were legitimate in what they were trying to pursue, it's immediately lost when a movement becomes a harassment movement, when it begins attacking people, when it begins threatening people. And this is a conversation I have with a lot of folks. Harassment in and of itself, threatening people, being a bad guy on the internet, whether that's on Twitter or DMs or email or on a phone call or with your clients or in business. being that kind of bad guy is not at all useful to whatever ends you are trying to pursue. So if we imagine that there was actually an issue, that there is an issue with video games journalism that could be addressed, that there is something that they could be doing better. And my recollection of the start of Gamergate, and I think where it got its name, was that there was, at the time that the thing started, a number of articles that essentially came out and said the name gamer was bad, or it was otherwise wrong to call people gamers for reasons that I can't quite recall, and I apologize for that. But that a bunch of these articles came out at once, and at least some group of the people that started the Gamergating were concerned that there was essentially a kind of tribal effect happening with games journalists, and they were all acting in concert in a way that was against this group, or that was against gaming in general, or were otherwise trying to hide the ball. And that might have been an interesting discussion to have at the time. However, when that becomes co-opted by people that just want to attack folks, and whether that's game developers or women or journalists or otherwise, when that happens, essentially it's much easier for anyone that could potentially be asked to change their behavior, or that has an ethical issue, or that otherwise should be brought into the conversation, to essentially ignore you. That to put you in a bucket if you want to talk about ethics in games journalism, and say, hey, you're with that crew that harasses women and that forces people out of their jobs and that sends threatening notes and swats people. And it's always antithetical to your ends. If you want to accomplish something, you don't harass people, because it's too easy to turn the other way and say, oh, those are just the idiot harassers. You can ignore them and whatever complaints they have, because they're obviously bad actors, they're obviously idiots, and so we can move forward with our lives. And that's essentially, from a 30,000-foot view, from someone that wasn't involved in Gamergate, that's what I see having had happened. I see a group of people that maybe had a kernel of an argument, and that was lost entirely in the noise of harassment and bad action. And that's what we've seen in all the articles that have come out. And I think that's a shame, because it prevents you from having a good substantive discussion about the things that you might want to talk about until years later. And this is the purpose of this article, is to say, how do we finally talk about ethics? Is that Gamergate essentially scorched the earth of having this conversation, and it's a good one to have. And he goes on to say it's a damn shame, all of it, and consumers deserve better, and journalists are getting squeezed. And he has all these theses essentially about the fact that there is a worthwhile discussion to have about what it means to have access, what it means for journalists to be squeezed. We saw a number of layoffs. We saw a number of firings of journalists even this past month, so throughout 2019 so far, and especially in the kind of digital marketplace. And this article talks about the fact that when you are getting squeezed, when you do have that pressure, it's easy to potentially get into a place where there is the ability to run afoul of ethical guidelines, to essentially sell yourself out in order to make sure that you can get clicks, that you can keep your job, etc. Now, I think he goes too far in this article. You can click on it. You can check it out for yourselves. He has these essentially concepts of publishers potentially handing out money for good reviews, and all these kinds of conspiracy theories, which I think are probably not terribly useful to the discussion to be had around what the modern media landscape is becoming. And that's really the conversation that I want to have with you. And I think you have, if you've followed this channel, if you've watched my episodes of Virtual Legality, you have some idea of how I feel the video games media process and pipeline is proceeding, especially through influencers and talking about how they advertise and what they say in terms of FTC compliance. That was an article or a video that I did earlier this week. But I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have, because I think it is easy for these journalists who are, I think, in general, trying to do a good job, trying to present an industry, trying to present new and interesting, thoughtful critiques of that industry from their own personal spin. But in an industry that access is so important for, that you get that pipeline, that you get those clicks because you have access to the CEO or to the creative lead on the project. And if you don't get that access, you might have trouble with your pipeline. There's very few kind of investigative journalists in video games or in media in general. It's not an investigative pursuit for the most part. There are exceptions to that. Jason Schreier of Kotaku being the leading example of somebody that really does bust open stories and get leaks and have those kinds of people, and is a good follow. And we're going to talk about him as well because he has his own thoughts on ethics in games journalism, some of which I agree with and some of which I don't. But if you have that access problem, if you're worried about getting fired the next day, there are reasons to believe from the outside, from the folks like me or like someone who's just enjoying video games and not necessarily making videos or posting on forums about it, there are reasons to say, hey, I'm not so sure that everything is above board, that everything's being handled fairly. Now, one thing I do want to say about this, and we're going to see it in some of the tweets that I've had and some of the conversations I've had online, is that there are notions here in this article that Mr. Pitts put together that money is exchanging hands, that potentially bribes are being bought, that people are being bought and paid for to get their reviews. I don't think that's what's happening for the most part. I think that obviously in any given industry in the world, in any business of any type, there can be bad actors. There can be essentially criminal actors that are trying to game the system, and that could be happening on the margins of the video game industry. But the big publishers, the big journalistic outlets, the IGNs, the GameSpots, the Varieties of the world, I don't believe are taking money in backroom deals or shady arrangements. But what they are doing is different than that. There is an access issue, and we're going to talk about that. So this is the article that's really created this conversation. If you've been on Twitter, if you've been on social media, you may have seen it from some of the journalists that you're following or some of the video game sites that you're following, people talking about these issues. And I think it's good. I think it's a good conversation to have. Unfortunately, one of the pieces of that conversation is often kind of defensive, and it often conflates a number of issues with the ones that I think are actually legitimate. And sometimes honestly, sometimes not so honestly, in terms of it's easy to conflate issues if you can knock one down, what we might call a straw man type argument. But the first of these, and one of the ones that I think that really starts to get under people's skin and again creates this kind of culture war clash with just a discussion of what's an ethical obligation, what should journalists be doing, what should journalistic outlets be doing, is the notion of politics in video game journalism. So we're going to talk about that. And the lead into that is going to be a Twitter thread that I was following from Jason Schreier of Kotaku. And again, this is the investigative journalist over there. He does great work. He's written a book. I think he's writing a second one. I do recommend checking him out. But he has very specific opinions about what it means to be a game journalist. And I think they are opinions that tend to close off discussion, that tend to close off argument. And I want to talk about that a little bit because I think that the whether or not politics involves video game journalism, whether politics is required to talk about video games, is essentially a separate discussion from whether games journalism is ethical. And I think it's an adjacent discussion, and I think that's why it comes up when we have these talks. But it's easy enough to essentially say, oh, this is just about politics. This is either the Republican side or the Democratic side essentially fighting amongst themselves, and one side wants their games journalism this way and the other side wants their games journalism this way, and that's what we're really talking about when we're talking about ethics in games journalism. And I think it's possible that some people are talking about that. I think it's possible that some people are motivated by either trying to have a more political approach or less political approach to discussing video games and media in general. But I don't think it's the beginning and the end of the discussion. And I don't think it's really what's at the heart of when we talk about ethics and when we talk about video game journalists. So I'm going to talk about politics just a little bit here. And here's the tweet from Jason. The starting point of the thread was, in reality, game reporters are both publicly and privately discussing ethical issues every day, from previews to blacklists to plagiarism. So it's hard not to see the escapists, but why aren't we talking ethics in games journalism as a dog whistle for the worst people? So he's essentially saying that he views essentially even asking the question as conceptually trying to bait those folks that want to have a culture war about the issue into proceeding to have that culture war. And we talked about the article, and I think it's a little bit clickbaity, and it is essentially trying to be provocative. And I think there's at least a kernel of a fair point there to say, hey, there's nothing that really isn't being handled right now. So this is essentially just clickbait, and you should take it as provocation as much as anything else. I will say this, in terms of that response, if we assume that Mr. Pitts is correct at all, that there is at least some portion of the populace that legitimately views there to be an issue about ethics, about how games journalists treat their subject matter, how they treat reviews, how they treat critiques of the video game industry. If there is at all that kind of concepting out in the public, it doesn't actually matter what game reporters are doing publicly and privately. If there's an issue, and I'm not saying that there is, I do think that there's something worthwhile to discuss. So for me personally, I think that there's a discussion to be had about ethics. But if there is in the public at large, then whatever games journalists are doing publicly and privately, as Mr. Schreer says, doesn't actually matter. It's not an argument to be made about why we shouldn't talk about ethics in games journalism, because whatever is being done is insufficient for your actual customer base, for your readership, for who you are trying to communicate with. And so I think it's well-intentioned. I think he's saying, hey, we talk about these things all the time. But to the extent that isn't properly communicated, to the extent it still looks potentially iffy, there are more steps to be taken. And I think he'd even agree with that kind of concepting. But what this actually goes into is what we started out as the preamble to this portion of the video, which is a Twitter user says, same dog whistle as we'll leave the politics at the door, which is essentially the thesis, the motto of another website that has started to talk about video games, which I want to say is called The Quartering. But I'm not familiar with, I haven't actually looked at their materials, but I think that they marketed themselves through Kickstarter and through other kind of pledge programs as essentially, we're going to take the politics out of our video game coverage. And Jason says, yes, absolutely. That's a gross and disturbing sentiment and such a privileged thing to say. And so he further goes on to say, it's impossible to detach art from politics. A video game site that actually leaves politics at the door would have to refrain from covering Call of Duty, The Division, Red Dead, and so on. No politics here is actually code for we're okay with the status quo. And here I think he's essentially absolutely wrong. And I think if there is this kind of culture clash between games journalists and gamers, or folks that don't like to call themselves gamers, but hobbyist game players, or whatever it is that you want to describe yourselves as, I think in all media, whether you're looking at a consumer review of a blender or a review of a video game, or whether you want to talk about a book or a movie, there are ways to talk about those things that are both evocative of the current media era, of the current political situation, and ways that are not. And I want to talk to you about those two different things, and I want to talk to you about it in the framework of some other media as well, because I think that this is one of those areas where it really conflates what it means to be ethical with what it means to be right, and there are a certain block of journalists that really want to have these conversations. They really want to have a critical study of the political implications of a video game and a video game's narrative, and what it means to play this particular video game or that particular video game, about the unionization of video game companies or the lack of unionization of video game companies, of the way that Red Dead Redemption 2 was made and whether the people got their bonuses or whether they were overworked. And I think that there is a place for that and that there's an audience for that, and I think that that's a perfectly worthwhile position to pursue. But it's not the only one. And I think whenever you have this kind of, this is a gross and disturbing sentiment to leave the politics at the door, you wind up closing off the discussion. You wind up saying those people are just evil and wrong and privileged. And that's really where a lot of this kind of clash comes from, and where it feels to some like journalists of a certain stripe are not necessarily servicing everybody. And I don't think they should have to, but I do want to talk about why I think the actual notion is wrong, and why there's a place for essentially both types of coverage. So to do that, I want to look at the review script for the Easy Allies review of Resident Evil 2, 2019. And the disclaimer here is, if you didn't come here through them, I have been a sponsor. Hoeg Law has been a sponsor of the Easy Allies for a number of years now. I love their content. I love the way that they look at video games, that they talk about the industry from an analytical perspective. I highly recommend checking them out if you haven't. This is the old Game Trailers crew with 9 of them on board, and so absolutely check them out. And that's my short advertisement for Easy Allies in the middle of a Virtual Legality episode. But if we take a look at this review, and this is the script, they do video reviews. If we take a look at this review, we can see there's essentially no kind of political context that is given to Resident Evil 2. And you wouldn't necessarily expect one. It's a game where you shoot zombies in the head in a fictional Midwestern town. But we can just kind of look at the first sentences of what they're talking about and see how a kind of clinical, non-political video game review as kind of a consumer product would look like. And you see here it says Resident Evil 2 originally released in 1998. The next paragraph is it's set in the fictional Midwestern town of Raccoon City. The next paragraph is Leon and Claire both have their own separate 6 to 8 hour campaigns. Each campaign takes place primarily in the Raccoon Police Department. Combat encounters are risky and dangerous even on standard difficulty. Zombies are more ferocious than ever, but hardly the most intimidating foe. Just when you think the situation is under control, Resident Evil 2 pushes back. If things are sounding too stressful, there are 3 difficulty settings. The puzzles have been reworked. The item box is essential. It looks stunning. There are a hefty amount of unlockable rewards. Resident Evil 2 manages to remain faithful to the original while simultaneously feeling new and modern. And those are the first sentences, basically, paraphrased in some cases, for the entire review. You see a kind of overview of what the game is, how it plays, how long it is, how it feels to play, what the experience of playing it is like, whether the graphics are good, how you feel about the sound, the music, etc. And it's a review of a product and what you can expect to experience if you play that product yourself. Easy Allies is pretty famous at this point for keeping most of the politics out of their coverage of video game reviews in particular, but even in kind of the discussions that they have about the industry. And I don't think anybody is worse for it. I think there are people that can like that concepting from Easy Allies. We're going to essentially maintain neutrality. We're going to talk about these things as products from a general love and respect for video games as they stand. But it's not the only way to treat it. And I don't mean to suggest that it is. Easy Allies could have decided to talk about a number of issues related to Resident Evil 2 and how it made them feel, which is what Waypoint did. If we look at this article, which is not a review, so I don't want to conflate the two. It's essentially an opinion piece, and Waypoint does a lot of this. I wish Resident Evil 2 let me be a more compassionate hero. And this is a discussion about essentially going through the police station and not wanting to necessarily just pick up everything because it feels like stealing, and how this person playing the game actually felt about the process of playing, in particular, that portion of Resident Evil 2. But it is rife with kind of political opinionation. And we see here in the piece that I highlighted here, talking about the police station in Raccoon City, that notion is wild. That police station as fortress safe haven is laughably naive, particularly for people of color. It certainly was in the 90s as well, and really, when has policing in America ever actually been about keeping neighborhoods safe as opposed to keeping a racist status quo up and running? Again, in an article giving opinions about how it feels to play Resident Evil 2. I don't think there's anything wrong with this. I actually find it fascinating. I didn't feel this way playing Resident Evil 2, but it doesn't mean that someone couldn't, and in fact, it looks like someone did, and I find that interesting. But not everybody would. It's not actually specific to how I felt about playing the game. It's not useful to my personal experience of playing the game, but it is something that's interesting to reflect on. But neither Easy Allies nor Waypoint is the right way to talk about Resident Evil 2. It's different ways of talking about Resident Evil 2. And so I think it is unfortunate that the Gamergate-ification of the discussion and discussion about ethics in games journalism winds up having this conversation piece be talking about whether or not politics is important to discussing video games. I think for some people, the Waypoint approach, and they do a lot of this with their video games, they talk about colonialism in Horizon and things like that. If you like that, this is here for you. And if you don't like that, other review sources, not just the Easy Allies, but other review sources across the internet are available for you as well. And it doesn't mean that the Easy Allies or anyone else that tries to take a very kind of neutral approach to reviewing these things as experiential as the video games as they present them themselves is wrong. It doesn't make this way right and that way wrong. And I think to suggest that it does makes things a lot more confrontational than they need to be. And so if you like Waypoint, absolutely check them out. They write some really good stuff. If you like Easy Allies, absolutely check them out. They do some really good stuff. And if you like Jason and Kotaku, check them out as well. There's a bunch of different voices and a bunch of different ways of pursuing discussions around the video game industry that involve politics and that don't involve politics. And I think if there's any pushback to the folks that say they don't want politics, it's in that kind of aggressive defensive stance that the folks like Jason Schreier have, which is essentially saying that it's gross to say that it can't involve politics, or that I don't want coverage involving politics. That winds up with essentially two people on either side of a line fighting across that line, and I don't think it needs to be that way. And I think it's a much more healthy, useful conversation to have where you're not kind of pinned up against each other. You're not combative in that fashion, and I'd love to see it more. And the other thing I would add to this is one of the things that comes up is that this is unique to video games, and it's not at all. I brought up here the Rotten Tomatoes website for Attack of the Clones, which you can see here is 65% positive, which is a lot higher than I would have guessed. So I guess the prequels were better thought of when they first came out. And if you've checked out my channel, you know I have a few things to say about Star Wars, so please do check those as well. I didn't love The Last Jedi, but we can discuss that separately. The notion of Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith is one that I wanted to talk about, because these came out essentially when I was in college and law school, and I had a number of good discussions about my favorite part about these movies, which was essentially the rise of Emperor Palpatine. Sorry, spoilers for the prequels for Star Wars, or really for like 1983, Return of the Jedi. But the rise of Emperor Palpatine through the ranks of how the Senate worked and how he became chancellor, how he maintained those chancellor powers, got the emergency powers, and essentially became emperor. And I really loved that through line through the prequels. And it's a very interesting one. It has a lot of relevance to thinking about politics, to thinking about democracies and republics. And I tend to equate it to the fall of the Roman Empire. And the people essentially voluntarily giving up their democratic powers to a leader that was charismatic in that they wanted to lead them through dark times. And I've always found that to be relevant and insightful and interesting. But certainly other people who have talked about Attack of the Clones and have talked about the rise of the Empire in the prequels in general have talked about it as an analog to what they felt was happening during the George W. Bush administration and some of those things happening in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I think that's fair as well. I think those kinds of discussions are interesting. But the question is always, are they necessary to discussing the notion of what it feels like to watch Attack of the Clones or Revenge of the Sith? And I would argue that they're not. I think it's good to have relevance and resonance in terms of storytelling to actual historical events, because it adds to a kind of layered feeling for a narrative. But Star Wars Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith lives and dies by the execution of the script and the execution of the visuals and the music and the acting and how it feels to actually watch the movie and to enjoy or not enjoy its plot. And also whether or not it's internally consistent. You can have all the messages that you want that are useful from a political perspective or from a social perspective. If they're not internally consistent to your story, or if they're just kind of tacked on, Canto Bite, then they're not as resonant. They're not as useful. They're not important to the story that's being told. And so I think when you say Attack of the Clones is a bad movie, which I think a lot of the internet feels, Attack of the Clones is okay. It's got one of my favorite pieces of music that John Williams ever did for the saga in it. If you say that it's not a good movie, you're not really talking about whether or not it's resonant with the fall of the Roman Empire or the George W. Bush administration, or you don't have to be talking about that. You can essentially evaluate it on its merits alone. And I think the position that you don't want to have politics in your video game coverage is really more along those lines, is saying, hey, I think it's interesting to talk about Star Wars and talk about the fall of empires and democracy and republics and all that, but it's not necessary to understanding whether I'm going to enjoy watching Attack of the Clones, or whether I'm going to enjoy watching Revenge of the Sith, or The Last Jedi, or The Force Awakens, or what have you. And I think there can be that separation. There can be those articles that talk about the more deeper kind of resonance, but I don't think it's necessary. And I think that's really the issue with talking about politics in any kind of media, is whether or not you absolutely have to talk about the unionization of the actors in the movie, or whether you absolutely have to talk about how this relates to modern Middle Eastern foreign policy that the United States held throughout the early 2000s, or things of that nature. So I think that's what I want to talk about with respect to politics, but I also want to move on to what I think is the bigger issue. I think that there really is a kind of conceptual ethics in journalism discussion to be had, and I think that really relates to access and payment, and now influencers. And so I want to go to one of the Twitter conversations I had the other day with Amanda Farrow, who, if you don't know, is the editor-in-chief of Game Daily Biz, which I have been happy to be quoted in and to discuss a number of their articles with their writers, and I think that is a great site to check out for business and legal issues with respect to the video game industry, so I highly recommend it. And I will try to link just to their overall website in my description. But she's responding to a tweet that was done by a man named Matt Frary, who is one of the head PR folks at Bethesda. And he's also responding to this overall conversation about talking about ethics in games journalism. And he says, websites don't promise high review scores for codes. PR people don't demand promises of high review scores for codes. That is a conspiracy theory promoted by trolls. PR people do avoid sending codes to known trolls. And Amanda says, in the rare instance where I've had to give a game a real dragging, I've never had PR balk at me for it, ever. Nor has PR ever asked me to give a potentially popular game a high score. Ever. To be clear, if that ever happened, that PR relationship would be torched like that. And I think that's an absolutely fair position to have. This is an editor of a games journalism outlet talking to a tweet done by a PR person for Bethesda that is sending out those review codes, that is organizing the interviews with their folks at Bethesda. And my response was this, because I think that's a great conversation to have. But I did say, I think the conspiracy, such as it is, lives in the gray area of PR people do avoid sending codes to known trolls. The distance between known troll and honest critic of a publisher's output may be a fair bit smaller for some than for others. And what I'm trying to get at here is to say, as soon as you admit that you are avoiding sending codes to people, the notion of what it means to be a known troll to Bethesda might differ pretty significantly from what it means to be a known troll to the rest of the populace. And so if you are an honest critic of a publisher's output, if you are a harsh critic, if you are very demanding, or you take down scores, or you're very adamant about the bugs that might be present in, say, Bethesda's output, and they are pretty well known for, at least at the initial launch, having a number of things that happen in their worlds because they are so big that are buggy. And so maybe your review style is just that bugs really hurt your immersion in a video game. They hurt it more than maybe the reviewer next to you or the viewer next to that. And so when you wind up reviewing Bethesda games, you wind up reviewing them much more low. And it wouldn't surprise me if in that circumstance, a publisher winds up saying, hey, we think you're a known troll, as this PR person says, and so we're not going to get you a review code. And if you're at all familiar with media journalism in general, those review codes are lifeblood insofar as a lot of the clicks, some high proportion of the clicks or the views or the sales of the output that you have as a journalistic creator is in those first couple days, when the embargo lifts, when all the reviews come out, that everybody's looking for a review of Resident Evil 2 or whatever the new hotness is in terms of video games or movies or what have you. And if you are not on that review code list, then you can essentially only get the game or other product when it's released to the public, and then it's another whatever period of time it takes you to review and to get an article out about that product after the release date. So if there's an embargoed period and an early review, you're talking about weeks or potentially even a month after the fact, after the deluge of people looking for that information, clicked on it and looked for it, that you can get your product out. And it's a big problem. That's what I talk about when I'm talking about access in the video game industry, as well as interviews and the like. It's as simple as the review code for a product that's coming out. If you're not on that list, that can be a significant problem for your outlet. And it's more of a problem for the outlets that are more like Game Daily Biz rather than the Varieties and the IGNs and the GameSpots of the world, because they have that lifeblood all the more. They don't have necessarily the same access to IGN interviews and IGN firsts and things of that nature. And so they have to be more careful about not burning bridges. And to some extent, it's easy for someone on the outside to look at it and say, okay, well, if this is that important to you, and if publishers do put people on known troll lists, is it not okay for us to sit back and say, wow, if I were in those shoes, if I were in that same position and I wanted to write something bad about a video game, I would have to think about whether or not that's going to put me on that known troll list. And I'd certainly have to be cognizant of which publishers have a more quick trigger finger on putting someone on a troll list than others. And I think that's just the human experience. And I think for those of us not involved in journalism, and I don't pretend to be at all. I talk to a couple of people on Twitter, and I contribute in terms of giving quotes to these journalists, to articles on Game Daily Biz and in Variety and elsewhere. But I don't know what their situation is like. I can only look at my human experience and say, if I were in these positions, I think I might have these feelings of potentially compromising or wanting to compromise or wanting to not lose business from my employer. And what's preventing me from doing that? And so I think it is natural for folks to look at it from the outside, and folks that aren't necessarily thinking about the whole business implications of things and say, hey, if they've got those pressures, maybe the reason all these review codes are positive is because somebody got money to them. And I don't think that's happening. But I do think that there is a kind of push and pull just from access and from publishers picking and choosing winners. And I think that is backed up by Brian Crescenti, who did a really nice tweet thread today about this notion, because he was seeing a lot of this pushback online. And he was seeing a lot of folks saying, essentially, there is no problem, there is nothing to discuss on this, and he wanted to talk about it. So I'm going to read most of this thread because I think it's very interesting. And I think it's something you should definitely follow. He's a great follow. He is the lead editor of Variety Gaming, and he has a great deal of experience in the industry. He was at, I believe, Kotaku before then, and he talks about these things on his Twitter a lot. And so he says, video game reviews, a cautionary tale. Video game reviews are once more under scrutiny, which is a good thing. They should always be under scrutiny. I would agree with many of the PR folk, journalists, and critics who say the old way of doing things, where publishers would try to have direct control of review scores and punish bad reviews, is mostly a thing of the past. But it's absurd to claim that no publishers try to sway reviews or review scores or how their games are perceived. The old ham-handed direct approach has been replaced by a more subtle, less obvious form of attempted influence. And while it's not as easy to spot, it's just as dangerous and damning. Now, some publishers try to influence scores by trying to control who reviews their games. So instead of reacting to a bad score, they proactively try to ensure that their games receive positive reviews. Let's stop right there. That's exactly what we would expect to see from a legal perspective, from a business perspective. The publisher is a business. It has every right to have this asset, review codes, that it can distribute as it will. So if it has on its list, and if it's got any kind of internal PR team, it has a list of reviewers that are more likely than not to treat a game negatively. And that can be for any number of reasons, whether they're fair or unfair, that they're going to treat this product that's going out the door negatively. Then it makes sense for the publisher to say, okay, at bare minimum, we're going to order this list. And if we have a certain number of review codes to go out, or if we have a certain number that we want to hit, we're going to go down from the top, who we think is most likely to be positive about this product, down to the bottom. And if we run out of codes, or if they're too far down the list, then they just don't get a code. And that's okay by us, because they were more likely to be more negative or more critical or more harsh on our product. And that makes perfect sense from a business perspective. That's exactly what you would expect from a publisher. Going on, in Mr. Crescenti's Twitter thread, a very real example from the past year, withholding the name of the very, very large publisher involved. A PR firm reached out directly to another reporter to give them review code for a game. When I contacted them to say I handle all video game coverage, I was told it too late. I was told it was too late, and that they had to give the code to the person they reached out to because paperwork had already begun. When I checked with the reporter, the paperwork turned out to be an email response that said, yes, I agree to the embargo. When I later brought this up to the PR person and the head of the department, they said they did this because they had a relationship with the reporter and wanted him to review the game. I told him there would never be a time, as long as I'm at Variety, when a publisher dictates who reviews a game. Variety no longer receives any early review code or executive interviews from the publisher. The publisher also refuses to talk about this directly. And I think this is an important story because it does talk about, at bare minimum, the kind of soft pressures that an editor is going to face when they run a video game editorial control board. And you see here, Brian Crescenti is strong enough to say, hey, we're not going to do this. You're not going to pick out your person in my stable that's going to review your game because you think they're most likely to be positive on your output. I'm going to do that. That's my job. And he said, if you're not interested in that, then we don't need to talk about this anymore. And that's a strong position to take. It is, frankly, an easier position to take with the leverage of a Variety or a large institution that can tell a publisher to go away and say that this is the way we do things. It's easy enough to extrapolate that if the publisher is doing things like this with Variety, that they are likely to be doing the same kind of things with smaller outlets. And so when we talk about what kind of output we're getting from those as video game fans, as people interested in the game industry, we see that if Variety is getting that pressure, it's likely that these other outlets are getting that pressure, and who, if any, are essentially allowing the publishers to pick their reviewers or potentially other kinds of concepts that relate to the video game review process. And so I think it's pretty easy for these conspiracies to develop because we do see this pressure. It makes sense for the publisher to exert this pressure. It always has made sense. And it takes a strong editor, it takes a strong institution to say, no, we're not going to do that because it's okay with us to wait on a review code. It's okay with us to not get that access because we're big enough, or we are just that strong ethically. And I think it's a good, excellent conversation to have because it is important for us to believe in essentially the veracity of what these journalists are putting out there. And in particular, this is the last piece I want to talk about on this video. In particular, it makes sense for journalists to separate themselves in this way because of the rising influence of influencers. And we talked about it earlier this week. We talked about it in respect of the Apex Legends launch. But it is clear that a number of video game publishers have rightly seen how useful it is to get YouTube and Twitch personalities, these influencers, involved in the game, marketing the game, selling the game for them. And we talked about it earlier in the video this week, but that relationship probably should be better acknowledged. It should be acknowledged as an advertisement or promotion material or sponsored material or what have you. But separate from that completely, it gets harder and harder to differentiate between journalistic outlets and influencers when they are at, say, the same events. And so it becomes ever more important for the journalistic outlets to essentially have a mission statement, to have a promise to their readers that says exactly what Brian Crescenti does here, that says, hey, you're not going to control our review process. We are not going to get paid for reviews. If we are sent somewhere, it will not be to the same location that influencers are at. Or if it is at the same location that influencers are at, we are going to get some kind of different access, or we're going to get interviews, or we're going to get those kinds of things. They're going to separate us from the people that you are essentially paying to market your game. Because the more those groups are conflated, the more influencers and journalists are difficult to separate in the minds of the public, essentially the less value that a journalistic endeavor has for that public. And I think the journalists need to be cognizant of that. They need to be jumping on that. And I do think it's worthwhile to have the conversation about ethics in games journalism as it goes now, because 2019, it might not be the start of when influencers really took this position. In fact, I think it was a couple years ago, but it is becoming more and more prevalent. And the success of the Apex Legends launch, how it was handled essentially in the course of a week, is going to lend itself to a number of the more MBA types, the PR types within these institutions, really looking at influencers as a viable pipeline for getting their message out without having to deal with all of these ornery journalists and their editorial controls. And so I think we're going to see that more and more. So my recommendation, if I have one for journalists in general, is to really try to differentiate themselves from influencers, because this is going to be a continuing issue, and I do think it's a worthwhile conversation to have, because I do think there is merit, there is usefulness, there is education to be had and information to be gleaned from the work these journalists are doing, from the work they're putting in to have these interesting interviews with these folks. I read an interview in Variety that was fantastic with the creative leads of Anthem, really talking about how they felt about what people saw as a games as a service move from BioWare that was outside of their narrative wheelhouse, and essentially admitting that and saying that a lot of people that do like the narrative wheelhouse of BioWare might well be disappointed with Anthem, but they want to make sure that they know there is new narrative coming down the pipe from BioWare. And I don't think that information would have come out. I don't think that that kind of interview would have happened, certainly from influencers, but from a lot of different journalistic outlets. And so I think there is value to be had in video game journalism. I think there are a lot of people doing a lot of good work from Waypoint, from Easy Allies, from Kotaku, from Game Daily Biz, from all these different sources. But it's going to become an ever-increasing battle to make sure that those voices are heard, to make sure that they are clearly independent and that they're not I'm going to use the phrase bought and paid for, but what I really mean is in terms of access and not cash by the publishers and by the developers. And so I think it will behoove all of these institutions to take greater steps to publicize the steps that Jason is saying that he's having with his editorial control board, as well as some of these other places, to publicize those, to really inform people that we are not going to accept publishers picking out who the reviewers are. We are not going to accept specific junkets that are going to have influencers there at the same time and with the same access, like was done with Apex Legends. That now is the time to have a good conversation about this, certainly between journalistic outlets, but also between journalistic outlets and their readership, because it is so important to make sure that you still do get good information, or before we know it, it's only going to be influencers all the way down. It's just going to be people that love Titanfall and got flown out to San Francisco to walk in a mech suit and get feted for 3 solid days and tell you how wonderful the game is because of all that. And so if we don't want that situation, if we don't want that future, I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have. Now, I know that's a hot button topic. I know that's a hot wire to touch. And if you've got any thoughts on it, if you want to re-educate me on the nature of Gamergate or on ethics in games journalism, or tell me the myriad ways I got things wrong, I am more than happy to hear those from you. I love hearing them. I love having this discussion. I love video games, obviously, and I love the future of information technology and software. That's why I do this series. That's why I have these conversations. So please do comment, like, subscribe. I do these kinds of episodes more than once a week now, and I really enjoy having these conversations. So thank you very much for listening if you're listening on a podcast, and if you're watching me on YouTube, thank you so very much for watching.